The Lord be with you. I'm Todd Townsend, Bishop of Huron. By this Sunday, July 12th, those who are following the lectionary readings will have come all the way to Genesis chapter 25, where we hear about the twins, Esau and Jacob. Their grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, were the ones who originally embraced the call of God. They've both died by now. Abraham left two lines of descendants, the descendants of Ishmael and of Isaac. And Isaac has married Rebekah, who gave birth to these twins, who struggled together within her even before they were born. The story begins a long section in Genesis in which we see the struggle and conflict that can arise and does arise when trying to follow the call of God. However, I'm still back in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, collecting the meaningful images of those narratives, back when God was still creating and promising a future to the creatures. So back earlier in Genesis, we want to go through these slowly because they're some of the most important parts of the Bible. We'll catch up to the twins, Esau and Jacob, before too long, but there's a lot of ground to cover before then. We need to see how we got from the goodness of the garden to the new promise of God embraced in Abraham to be God's people. And in all this, we're looking for God in and behind, sometimes the story in behind. What is God up to here? What kind of God is revealed in these stories? We're seeing that the ultimate meaning of creation is to be found in the heart and purpose of the Creator. So we want to get at that. We want to figure out the Creator's purpose in order to figure out how we can live freely and faithfully as human beings. So far in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, we've seen that when God summons something into being, it comes with a promise. Genesis is the beginning of God's creative activity, creating something out of nothing, combining emptiness with dryness and dust, and putting it together with water in order to breathe life into the creatures, and seeing that these creatures are good. The creatures are given partnership and companionship, and they have a good relationship with God, and they're promised something good in their living. Everything is alive and free and good in this garden called Eden. And then we notice something else too, that the human creatures are put at the center of the story. It may be the result of the fact that it's told to the human creatures, but they're part of a creation, but they're placed at the center. They're placed in a creation that already exists. The waters, the vegetation, the living creatures, the sky, the land were already there. God saw that they were good too first, and blessed them first. And it was into this world that humans came, made in the image of God, to have dominion over it. Now, a lot of trouble has come from that phrase, to have dominion, to be in the image of God and have dominion over. It's a point we can't overlook, that we humans are to order and care for other creatures as God would do, to maximize God's mission, not ours, not the profitability of our empires. And we have in so many ways plundered God's creation and soiled it permanently, which is a sin. And that is why we need to move on and pay attention to chapter 3 of Genesis. Here we come to what is sometimes called the fall. Somehow in this beautiful, free, joyous, blessed creation, the creature feels the need to resist. It's a very strange thing that in the whole cosmos, I assume, that a tension exists on the one hand between this God who creates and blesses and promises and insists on staying in relationship with the creatures, and on the other hand, the creatures who receive and enjoy the gifts of creation, but then begin to resist the Creator. So let us right now thank God for persisting with us in spite of this resistance. This tension is important to remember when we think about the fall. God and God's creation are bound together in a distinctive and delicate way. And it could be that human beings are both the glory of the earthly creation and the central problem of creation. The challenge to us is that according to these traditions, the destiny of the human creature is to live in God's world according to God's terms, not in a world of our making. We're to live in God's world alongside God's other creatures, and we are to tend it and till it. This, if we could do it, would be our joy and our delight. But we are to do it on God's terms, not our own. And if we cannot do that, we create our own alienation. When we're thinking about what we read in Genesis chapter 3, especially alongside chapter 2, we have two of the most important chapters in the Bible. They're so important because they speak profoundly to the origin and destiny of the human beings who are set on this earth. They may also be two of the most abused and misunderstood chapters in the Bible. Oh, that's saying something. The first misunderstanding in there is that maybe I ought to avoid referring to this incident in the garden as the fall. Often the whole Adam, Eve, serpent thing is used abstractly to speak of how it was the moment when sin, death, and evil came into the world. And doing that objectifies them. It makes these things things in themselves, manageable, and as though they're separate from the whole of life. It separates them in a way that makes them more manageable. But when it comes down to it, this story isn't really about that. These origin stories really aren't. They just say that evil exists, that this temptation is there, and that we know that God continues to summon us, come close to us, keeps blessing us and giving us a future in spite of sin, death, and evil being in the mix. They are never enough to separate us from God, as we see. You may want to go to the prophets, Hosea or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, if you want to see an accurate view of how the failings of sin in humankind destroy things. But in this story of Eden, it's not really interested in that. It's not an explanation of how evil comes into the world. We can't blame Eve. We can't blame Adam. We can't blame it on the serpent. Adam, Eve, and the serpent are just showing us something that's real in every one of us. We see in them what we're like, and it's helpful to know that. These stories reveal something about our origins, but they're more interested in showing us what God is like. So this doesn't explain much about evil. It does reveal the human desire, a deep desire to run our own show, to look out for number one, to try to do away with our dependence on God. Right from the beginning, we thought that we could just try that tree over there. Maybe God's keeping something from us. Maybe God's being selfish and keeping godlike powers to himself. That would be right. God was. Because you cannot be a creature and the creator at the same time. Even if you could, too difficult, too heavy, beyond the expectations of being human. And that's what we need to be, properly human. The serpent tempted them, they ate the fruit because they wanted to be like God. They wanted to be a God of their own lives and to live on their own terms, according to their own rules. And it only leads to alienation and distance from God and one another. And yet, after it happened, God accompanies them out of the garden, clothes them, and sends them to this new place. And there, God begins the new mission of trying to bring them back to that garden-like state of relationship with God, a mission that we see playing out in the rest of the scriptures, especially in the mission of Jesus. Let's take a week or to mull over these chapters. Next week we'll cover a lot of ground leading up to chapter 12, where we'll see finally the call of Abraham and Sarah. Blessings on you all, in the name of God. Amen. Now, those of you who stick around to the end of these videos, maybe to see where I've been visiting, will be disappointed this week because I didn't get too far. I'm in my own backyard right now. I had a technical glitch in the place I went with the sound, so we've fixed that. And I do plan to travel around the diocese a bit. I may be able to talk to some people along the way and show you some views of the Diocese of Huron. So watch for that next week. Until then, have a great week.